Funding for this project was provided by Trees Incorporated. Trees Incorporated is a not-for-profit organization that was formed in 1990 to encourage the planting of trees. For more information, visit www.treesinc.org.
Marion Jackson connected with nature at a young age. Growing up in rural southern Indiana, he spent his time learning and appreciating the outdoors. This love of nature carried on through his life in becoming an award-winning ecologist, novelist, and teacher.
I was born in what's now Versailles State Park, and it's been a state park since the late 30s. And then we moved to a little, it's not really a village, it's just a church in the country, a little area called Tanglewood, and that's where I grew up. I'm the youngest of 7 siblings, and we were basically on a general purpose farm, typical of that time and place. Both my parents, they were very interested in nature, and I pointed out all of the birds that were common, in the neighborhood and so forth. And I started searching for bird nests when I suppose I was about 8 years old. And I recorded my observations in little notebooks that we could buy at the drugstore at that time. They were for 1 cent, if you can believe that. You can't buy anything for 1 cent now. We buy these little notebooks, and they were about 3 inches by 5 inches. And I would keep records of the bird nests that I found and which species and so forth. I didn't have a bird guide. That was a kind of a rare item back then. But there was a book in the Versailles library where I went to school that was, it was called the Burgess Bird Book for Children. It was written by Thornton Burgess, and it's still in print around places. You can find it occasionally. And he described all of the birds and where they nested and so forth through the eyes of Peter Cottontail. Well, I didn't go to college right out of school, although I had a nice scholarship for DePaul University. And I don't know why people, when they're 17, they do all kinds of things, that don't make much sense. So I didn't go to college right away. And so I spent 2 years on active duty in the Navy on shipboard as an electronics technician. And after I got out, I had the GI Bill coming to pay for college expenses. So I went to college in Purdue University on the GI Bill. And that's where I met the professors and so forth that got me interested in a career in ecology and natural history, interpretation and so forth. I taught ecology, and I taught taxonomy of vascular plants and so forth, and identification and recognition of trees was a big part of that, of my courses. And so my students and I, we went to all these neat places around the state and became familiar with the state parks and the natural areas and so forth. And about that time, I became very interested in the Nature Conservancy, which is a land protection agency in the state. And I was chairperson of the Indiana chapter of Nature Conservancy for several years and so forth. And one of the wonders of a job with a university is that at that time we had our summers free. And so I would go to really neat places and spend the summers there. I spent the summer on a fire tower in Idaho doing fire detection and suppression. And I spent 2 summers at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. And I was an interpretive naturalist there. And I got to see different parts of the country and so forth. I spent 2 summers in Alaska. One, I took a class there. We traveled over 12,000 miles in Volkswagen minibuses at that time. And Dr. Moulton in the geography department at ISU, he and I took that class. And then I went back another summer in far western Alaska to study the breeding birds, and particularly the emperor goose, which most people in this part of the country have never seen. It doesn't come this far south. And I was studying the nesting behavior and the nesting ecology of the emperor goose while I was there.
While teaching at Indiana State University, Dr. Jackson would often take his students into the field for real-world experience. He helped many students find their path to working in ecology.
He was one that got us outside, got us thinking about our environment around us. I always knew that I wanted to pursue a career with animals. So everything he taught me just helped me with the background that I would need. And his teaching techniques actually helped as well. Kind of formed the way I think about the environment.
He really opened my eyes to the natural world. You know, even though I grew up out in the country, I wasn't aware of how much was out there because we lived on a farm with an old pasture and a woods that didn't have any flowers in it because the cows had been grazing in it. So when I took some of his classes and said, wow, there are beautiful flowers out here in the springtime, and look at these birds I've never noticed before. So my eyes were really open to the natural world, and that's why I became a naturalist.
He is the best forest ecologist that I've ever known. I mean, his knowledge in forest ecology is, I think, unsurpassed. He's an excellent taxonomist, plant taxonomist, and botanist. There are not too many professors today that do the kind of field work that Dr. Jackson did. And he spent a lot of time in the field working on state nature reserves, doing plant inventory work, and everything from trees to shrubs to wildflowers, ferns, anything that grew out of the ground.
I'd been editor of the Indiana Academy of Science proceedings for 5 years and had quite a bit of editorial experience. So when they decided to do the natural heritage of Indiana, I guess I was kind of a logical choice. IU Press, along with Indiana State and others, they suggested that I be the editor of that volume. I chose that title because we have actually 100 or 200 trees in Indiana that reach, adult size and so forth. So that was kind of a catchy title that I think people have appreciated. Yeah, this was really a serendipity that I just was able to capitalize on, to find these two people, one who was an artist, and she drew the characteristics of all the trees in the sketches. She was a student in my class at ISU and an art major, and so I asked her if she would draw the trees, the sketches of the trees of Indiana for the book. And she says, "Oh my, I only draw animals. I couldn't draw a tree." And I said, "Well, trees are easier to draw than animals because they stay put. They don't move around." I said, "Would you try to draw me a few sketches of trees and so forth?" And I liked her work very much, so I talked her into doing the trees of Indiana. We went to every county in the state, and that's the travels that I said my wife Jaleh went with me on almost all of these. And we searched existing woodlots and so forth, and even the roadsides and whatever, looking for trees of those species that were missing. There was quite a number of counties that we added new trees to there, so people can go to those counties and expect to find a tree of that species if they look. She gave me moral support for one thing. It was we went to every county in the state of Indiana and checked the records of trees to see if all the different species were in fact growing there. And she's a trained nurse, a registered nurse, and spent her whole career doing that. And so she grew up overseas. She's from Iran, and came here after our girl's father was killed, And so we then became married, of course, and she got a great interest in trees, and got so she was very good at identifying them. So she traveled all over the state with me, and we searched for records of the trees in the counties as a part of that. Yes, that's a tract of timber that was settled by a family by the improbable name of Hoot, H-O-O-T, and they came here from Germany in the 1860s, I believe, and settled on that land, which has been in the family pretty much ever since. It's in Owen County, over near Spencer, Indiana, south and west of Spencer. And so I did a mapping inventory of all the trees in Hoot Woods. And every 10 years gone back with my students and I, and we've resurveyed that, and we measure how much each of the trees have grown, which trees have died, which have grown into the stand, and so forth. I got to know an older couple years ago. I guess it's been around nearly 50 years ago now, that they had come here from Switzerland, and they'd settled at St. Mary's, and he worked in the coal mine that St. Mary's College owned there, and he bought a little 20-acre tract of land. And when he lived in Switzerland as a young man and as a boy, he always hoped that he could have a tract of land. And so he had the opportunity to buy this 20 acres. It's adjacent to the village of St. Mary of the Woods here in Vigo County. And when he and his wife got old and were faced with going to a nursing home, he contacted me and said that he would be willing to sell the land. And he, since I was interested in trees and natural history and all that, he said he'd like for me to have that. But he asked me one thing. He said, you have to promise me that you won't cut a single tree on this land as long as I'm still living. So I honored that respect and that request. And so a few years ago, I donated it to the Land Conservancy here in Indiana, and it's a dedicated state nature preserve now. We called it, his name was Snyder, Julius Snyder, and so we named it Jackson Snyder Nature Preserve.
Dr. Marion Jackson has been a member of Trees Incorporated since 1999. Dr. Jackson's book, 101 Trees of Indiana, was the inspiration for the award-winning project at Memorial Stadium in Terre Haute, which was completed in 2006 by Trees Incorporated.
Well, there's a trail around the stadium that ISU has for football stadium, and it's a park here in the city that encircles this, and it's laid out in the shape of the state of Indiana, and it's exactly 1 mile in distance all the way around this tract. And so Trees Incorporated had the wonderful idea that, well, let's plant the 101 trees as they are described in the book, 101 Trees of Indiana, around the perimeter of this park.
They are really trying to keep the trees healthy, to replace the ones that have been damaged or died, to bring in new species that haven't been there yet, and to make it a little more educational for the public as they walk around that mile.
Been quite a number of people, and that's been one of the most encouraging things about the project, was the fact that so many more people have become interested in nature and interested in preservation and that sort of thing. And that's what the mission of the book was intended to be, was to get people more interested in nature and to help people become more understanding of what's here and an appreciation for it, certainly. People have got very interested in improving the forest conditions in Indiana, and a lot of private landowners are planting trees, and there's a resurgence in interest in that. So the actual acreage in forest in Indiana has been increasing slowly. It'll never be back to the way it was, probably I would say 80% of Indiana was forested originally. And of course, most of it is now towns and cities and farmland and so forth. So we'll never have a forested state here again. But I look to have quite a bit more forest land because people are very interested in this now, and there's quite a lot of planting going on.
Dr. Jackson has devoted his entire life to the wildlife of Indiana, working to expand conservation efforts as well as preparing the next generation to take care of the environment.
Funding for this project was provided by Trees Incorporated. Trees Incorporated is a not-for-profit organization that was formed in 1990 to encourage the planting of trees. For more information, visit www.treesinc.org.